At this point, Seth Leipson will be moderating the discussion. He's a fellow of the Claremont Institute, the executive director of Americans for Victory Over Terrorism, and producer of Bill Bennett's Morning in America. Mr. Leipson specializes in issues relating to the war on terrorism as well as domestic policy, including race preferences, the First Amendment, education reform, and religious freedom. He has a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in political science from the Claremont Colleges and a law degree from Northeastern University, where he founded the school's chapter of the Federalist Society. His writings have been featured in various journals in print and online. Please join me in welcoming Seth Leipson.
And thanks for having me here, and thanks for coming here and taking time out of your very busy weekends when you could be doing so many other things. I made a lot of notes for this panel and for what we were going to do today, and I threw them all out last night when I was just so totally overwhelmed by what I saw on a Friday night on an elite college campus, on any college campus. 200 students giving up their Friday night to come and talk and listen and participate in a conference on the most serious issues of the day, issues of family, faith, culture, religion. It was just so moving that I threw out all the technical stuff I had and all the research I did. And I thought, you know what, we're going to hear from you, and we're going to take all the ingredients we've heard from last night to now that have been put in this big pot, and we're going to let it boil with your feedback and comments with our panelists today, because you are the experts, you are the revolutionaries, you are the ones who are living out what all the speakers thus far and in a few minutes have been talking about. And I think you can probably educate us as much as we can educate you. So, first of all, thank you. Thank you for what you do. Go ahead, give yourselves a round of applause. How many of you in this room, by show of hands, are engaged to be married, out of curiosity? How many of you want to be engaged to be married, by show of hands? Good, good. Well, let me give you a piece of advice. I want to recognize my wife here, Elaine. Thank you for coming, Elaine. No. We only do positive things. If we study positive things, we'll get positive answers. Here's my piece of advice. I was wedded to Elaine 3 times. All in the same year, no divorces, don't worry. Once by a rabbi, once by a judge, and once by a high-ranking federal official. I just wanted every base covered. I loved her so much. My piece of advice: the wedding is not the event. Marriage is the event. That is what lasts. That's where your memories will come from. That's where your souls will be nourished. For those of you who get all caught up in the wedding, the ceremony, don't be. That's not what the big deal is. The marriage is the big deal. Before we turn to our panelists, who I'm not going to formally introduce, I've asked their permission. It's okay. We're all literate. We can read, so we can get to things. I just wanted to say one thing. To me, the most important word in this conference, sexuality, integrity in the university, is integrity. Last night, Dr. Madigan, before introducing the Casses, gave a wonderful definition of it. And I hope there's a transcript. But I want to give you another one. And it comes from the Navy. If you trace back the roots of the word integrity, it actually does mean whole and wholeness. Any Navy captain will tell you before he takes off, before they set sail, he will ask, does the ship have integrity? Do you know what that means? It means everyone on the ship's staff has to check every door, every opening, every watertight seal on that ship before it leaves port to make sure it is closed, that it is watertight, that there is wholeness. And once the captain realizes that that has been accomplished, that everything has been checked out, that every hole is covered, that every opening is tight, he will say the ship has integrity. And then they can set sail on their mission. That is what I get from you. And that, I think, is what your mission is, to have integrity. I think it is the most important thing, the thing most lacking in society, and the thing that I think you're going to show us adults, people that live in the culture outside the university campus, how we can return to that which you view as so important, because it is important. The culture gives us a lot of bad messages. How many of you, last show of hands, I promise, and then I'll let you only raise hands to ask questions, but my last question to you is, how many of you are science and engineering majors? And how many of you are majors in the humanities? Interesting statistic, interesting research just came out from the University of Michigan this year. Those who attend universities and major in engineering and the sciences, by and large, have a better record of maintaining their religious commitment when they came in the university. Those who major in the humanities have less. Isn't that interesting? In the 50s and 60s and 70s, we thought science was religion's biggest challenge. Turns out science is not the bête noire of religiosity, but the humanities. And what a tragedy. Thinking about all the wonderful literature that was cited in last night's lecture, all the philosophy you get from Robbie George, that as it now is taught in the mouths of the current professoriate and in the ethos of the college campus, that is our greatest challenge. It's in the humanities, it's not in the sciences. I'm glad we're in an engineering building. That is your challenge. More hands went up as humanities majors. So God bless you, God love you. With that, I'm going to go to Russell Moore, our first speaker. You read his bio in your booklets, and we'll get right to it. Everyone gets 10 minutes up here. I produce and co-host a radio show, so I know what time segments mean. If I miss them, I'm in commercial break. So I can be talking about Aristotle or Howard Dean or Barack Obama, and if I miss the commercial break, and Howard Dean said, "What tires do you use?" So I'm going to be pretty militant about that. 10 minutes. Russell Moore, thank you.
Thank you, Seth. One of the scariest sounds I think I've ever heard in my life was a voice screaming, "Daddy." And it was a moment that kind of is seared in my consciousness because I had been traveling with my wife and our 4 small boys across the country, and we were stopping on a roadside exit off the interstate going into a hotel, and I was tired and exhausted. I'd been listening to disputes going on in the back of the minivan about he touched me, he took my Legos away, he's obscuring Pink Panther on the DVD player, and I'm dealing with all of that and just the exhaustion of travel when we stopped at this hotel, and I walked up to the front desk to see if there were rooms available. And while I was standing there, the woman that was working at the front desk looked remarkably like a woman that I had known back in college. And as I sat there and stood there and talked with her for a few minutes, we're talking about very innocuous things, about the football game that was taking place down the street in that little town, about the thunderstorm that had been coming through. Nothing untoward was happening either in my mind or in reality. But I found myself simply enjoying this conversation. For a moment, just for a split second, I wasn't Pastor Moore, I wasn't Dr. Moore, I wasn't Daddy. I was simply Russell Moore. When all of a sudden I heard, "Hey Dad, look at this." And I turned around and there was my 4-year-old son on the luggage cart pushing it back and forth like a train swinging from the top of it. And suddenly I was made aware by a voice of the fact that in that little minute or two I was in an illusion, and it was a dangerous illusion. Now, nothing was going to happen. She had absolutely no interest in me. I had absolutely no interest in her in any untoward kind of way. But I had forgotten who I was. And the more that I thought about that, the more it bothered me. Because I thought, what if I had been here alone? And what if the situation hadn't been as innocent as it was, but it had turned into something else? I would be able to shut down the memory of who I am and what I'm about. That's not unique. That is absolutely ubiquitous in human nature. And that's what's so important in all of you as you are preparing to engage your universities and your cultures and later on the rest of your lives when it comes to dealing with issues of marriage and sexuality and integrity. It's the fact that it is easy to live in an illusion. And when it comes to the very core of who you are as a sexual being, as a being made for marriage and for family and for giving of oneself to others, that is especially dangerous. Now, I speak as an evangelical Protestant who can't help but speak in reference to the evangel, to the gospel. And what I would say to you is that from the Christian tradition, that issue of integrity in identity, in desire, in purpose, is something that goes all the way back to the biblical revelation of the temptations of Jesus himself. Temptations that cut at the very core of what it means to be human. And so when you are engaging in issues of marriage and sexuality and family, you are getting, first of all, at the issue of identity, the question of who am I? The question that the biblical writers tell us was given to Jesus in the wilderness was, if you are the Son of God, repeatedly, if you are the Son of God. I think there are two parts to that. If you are the Son of God, you are dependent upon your Father. And if you are the Son of God. Part of the reason why sexual chaos and sexual confusion is so easy to fall into is because we all have a temptation to think of ourselves as creatures without limits. We think of ourselves either as gods who simply can create reality the way we want it to be, the pornographic illusion that we saw some moments ago, or as animals, as those who are simply driven along by our instincts. Part of what it means to pierce through the illusion is to say, no, you are not a god and you are not an animal. You are a person, as Robbie George was speaking of some moments ago. You are a created being and a created being with limits. You have to address the issue of identity. You also have to address the issue of desires, an illusion of desire. Part of the reason why so many people are ineffective in speaking about issues of marriage and sexuality is that it seems to the culture we're trying to engage as though we don't understand the force and the pull of the desires. When, of course, you should. You must understand and know that the pull toward sexuality is different than the pull toward any number of other problematic features that you might be addressing. It gets at the very root of the appetites themselves. The people that you are conversing with and dialoguing with have an innate, intuitive quest for the sexual mystery because they are designed as sexual beings. That's the reason why the pull is so strong. In order to fully address that, you have to peer into the mystery of human existence of what people are created for. And that means, finally, you have to address that illusion of purpose. Most of the people who seem to be seeking orgasm are not seeking orgasm at all. And most of the people who are seeking intimacy are not seeking intimacy alone at all. What they are seeking is ecstasy. What they are seeking is mystery. And in so doing, they are seeking the very root and the core of what it means to be human. Now, part of what you're going to have to be doing as you call for integrity, as you call for an integrity in sexuality and in marriage, is doing exactly what the environmental movement has been calling us to do all along when it comes to natural resources. It's to understand that we are limited creatures who are given a stewardship over nature, but we are not greater than nature. Right down the road from me, there lives a Kentucky farmer, an essayist, and poet by the name of Wendell Berry, who has spent a generation asking the question, what are people for? What is land for? What is nature for? And it seems to me that the very same laissez-faire attitude that would say, I am able to destroy this land, therefore I will destroy this land, with no understanding of the implications of that, can just as easily be translated into the personal. Sexuality, the male-female duality. It is something that I can simply do with as I please because I can. But ultimately, you can't. Nature has a purpose, has an end, has a direction. So when you are speaking to issues of integrity in marriage and sexuality and family, you are not speaking about something different than faith. You are speaking instead about the very fundamental question, what are people for? You're breaking through an illusion, and you're doing it with a voice.
It took everything I had not to give him a high five on that one, but thank you, Doctor. Every nation is formed around something. A principle, a personality, a monarchy, an ideal. And the nation rallies around that to get a common ideal. And it becomes a thing that animates that culture, that nation, that group. This nation was founded around the law. Now, not the law in the sense of the positivism that it is what I say it is. In fact, the nation could be argued was founded in reaction to that kind of law, that positivism of a king that says it's law, so let it be written, so let it be done. This nation was founded around law in the more classical sense of that which is unchangeable, that which is knowable, that which is unchangeable from season to season, from culture to culture, through religion, rooted in the identity of the human person. And what has been known as a natural law, which is not a term that works well today. You speak about nature, and nature in our culture is something that needs to be overcome. Darkness by fluorescent lights, loneliness by a television. And you speak about law, and law has taken on this sense of, well, there have been so many bad laws. How do you know that any law is particularly objectively good? But when we speak about those unchangeable truths that every human person encounters, we begin and end with the human person. And in the formation of this country where we live and we express our faith as believers in speaking what we know to be true through our particular faith traditions, we still hold that common thread of the unchangeable truths of the human person. Which is why people of faith of different traditions can stand together and speak in a common point, if not common language. Because what we seek with all of our energy, with all of our being, is truth. The truth. In fact, we share more common with the doubter, with the atheist, who authentically is seeking the truth, than for those who simply accept what is what is. We seek the truth. And if you accept the premise that the human person is drawn to know not just truth, but the fullness of truth, then you have the handle, as it were, for bringing our faith to bear in the public square. We speak about things, and much of my work is around marriage and family and sexuality and living out the great, beautiful truths in and through my Catholic traditions, the language and approach, but all speaking to that dignity. And dignity in the classic sense meaning a reverence, an awe, a worth. The reverence, the awe, and the worth of the human person, which resonates in every heart, throughout every religion, throughout every encounter, because it's rooted in the human person. And issues of sex and sexuality get to the very core of the human person, because in all of the major traditions it's recognized that this identity as masculine and feminine is something that originated in the beginning, that had its meaning, which is that internal truth, and its purpose, that external encounter, from the beginning. That from the very beginning we're made male and female not just to be different from each other, but to be different for each other. That we use the human experience, the encounter of our own relationships, and in that seeking and that drawing of the fullness of truth, we want to know more. We want to know more. I use the example oftentimes, particularly in this challenge today around the debate on same-sex marriage, as what we offer the culture is not optional. This is what we're called to do, those of us who have been drawn into the faith. We are called to speak truth, whether it be to power or to weakness, to speak the truth in all season. And it's much like an iceberg. Now, I'm a recovering engineer, so I have to apologize in the beginning that there's a It's been 7 years, and recovery's going pretty well, but every once in a while I flash back into my ordered world. And in my world, as engineers and scientists know, everything has a box. And every box has a label. Now, things may be out of the box, but you know where to put it back when it is out of the box. It's just an ordered and integral, whole universe. We think of the iceberg. And an iceberg is, you study those, the majority of that iceberg is underwater. What's above the water is observable by anybody. You can see the iceberg from any perspective, any angle, and speak about the truth of that iceberg as observed universally. And that, in a sense, is what we share in the public square. That's what we share with anyone. This is what we see. This is water. This is family. This is love. This is money. It's the observable common experience of a thing. But those of us who've been given the gift of faith, in a very real sense, it's like getting a fuller vision. It's what Fulton Sheen called Christ-colored glasses, where it's not a denial of what is objectively seen and universally seen, but it allows us to see the why behind the what. It allows us to see the internal meaning as well as the external purpose. But more importantly, it allows us to see as this iceberg, the mystery of that iceberg that in that sense, in that analogy, is hidden beneath the water, as it were. Where we can speak fluidly as people of faith about that iceberg that is submerged and, if you were, a mystery of the iceberg, just as fluidly as we speak about the observable top portion that anyone can observe. It's that way with marriage. The universal experience of marriage that crosses all culture, all religion, all languages, and all time. Marriage is a universal, one of the very few human universals. And we share that common experience of speaking about that iceberg of marriage above the water. And yet in the same wholeness, integrity, fluidity, we can speak of that human experience of marriage as well as the mystery of the why behind the what. So the first order of business for people of faith in speaking truth to the culture is recognizing how much we share, but also how uniform and integral the observed universal experience is with the revelation, the revealed truth of that which may not be achievable or aimed through reason, however right and enlightened, but that which must be told and literally revealed, pull back the veil to show us what it is in its fullness. That should give us a confidence, con fide, with faith. We walk to the public square not imposing, not proselytizing, not trying to change people's minds, but with a joy and an exuberance speaking about this uniform truth of what is. It's observable to look at the man, a masculinity, and recognize that masculinity makes no sense, if there were no such thing as woman. That femininity, inexpressed in and through the body, makes no sense if there were no such thing as male, masculine. That in a culture that looks for truth in a reductionism, that if you want to know what water is, you need to know the molecules, 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen. You need to recognize not just the atom, but you got to go deeper and to know the protons and the neutrons, and that you got to dig deeper. That's a reductionist thing that's so embedded in our culture. It's in the water we drink and the air we breathe. And yet when it comes to issues of sex and sexuality, the reductionism falls very short. The deepest understanding of sex and sexuality is not in the reductionism to the parts, but in the relation of the persons, of the dynamism, of the human dynamic of persons. That's more profound than you may think. The relationality, not the reductionism. But the universal nature of masculinity and femininity, of human relation, of sexual desire and sexual encounter, is the privileged place where people of faith now can draw to that deeper why behind the what. That doesn't diminish romantic love. That doesn't diminish commitment and the joy that we feel in the suffering of giving ourselves away for the good of another person. It's universal. Now is the time, as all time is, now is the time for those with that deeper and full vision, with those Christ-colored glasses, to speak boldly about what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful, and not be silenced by the culture that thinks plurality means diminishing your particular point of view. No. The greatest enemy you and I serve is the timidity to speak about what we know is good, true, and beautiful. Our fundamental role, the evangelism, our fundamental goal, our fundamental truth, and the fulfillment of our own self is taking what we have been given both by right reason and through revelation and speaking boldly in the public square about what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful. And I hope to share that with you. And yes, you will be stoned. Don't think I'm trying to romanticize it. You will be stoned. But ain't it great? Thank you very much.
First of all, I really appreciate being invited back. Again, I was part of the conference on pornography, which was a deeply troubling conference in the same way that the previous, for those who were here for Pamela Paul's, that was also, she said, oh, you had to go through that, suffer through that twice. I said it was as troubling the second time as it was the first time. But we had, I think, 2 talks about faith, so I'm going to talk about fidelity maybe a little bit. I took permission from my wife to talk about fidelity. The word faith is from fidelity. One of the interesting things about fidelity is that it's rooted in the idea of faith. It's also rooted in the idea of loyalty, which is faith also. Who you show your loyalty to. The Marines say semper fi, always faithful, semper fidelis, always faithful from their Latin motto. The idea of always being faithful to the men that you serve with, to the country that you serve with. There used to be a name for a dog that was quite common in this country in the 1930s and 40s, Fido, and which is faithful, the idea of being faithful. Dogs are amazing in their faithfulness. In fact, we have a bumper sticker in California that says, the more I get to know men, the more I like my dog. And I think in that is the idea of the unfaithfulness of so many men in our culture. But I think what a lot of women are unaware of is that the numbers are starting to become equal nowadays, that there are, in fact, some social science indicating that men now are as unfaithful, women are as unfaithful as men. And what a wonderful equality. You know, I always said when women said, you know, we want to be equal to men, I said, why have you set your sights so low? Chastity is the great virtue of women. Chastity is what women teach us. They teach us how to be faithful. In fact, caritas, the word for love, which is related to fidelity, was personified by Renaissance painters with the mother and her children. That is the idea of love. The embodiment of love has always been with our women. Our mothers teach us love. They give us unconditional love. Their love is like the love of God. In fact, Paul said, love your spouse to the men, love your wives like Christ loves the church. I mean, there is the idea of giving them the love that they give you, which is so extraordinary, so unconditional, and so amazing. And yet we live in a culture increasingly where fidelity seems to have really no meaning. If you watch films or television programs or these things, one would think that there was no such thing as marriage. And if there is, it's marriage and the family. That marriage is a completely dysfunctional institution. And there's, I think, some evidence for that. The dysfunctionality of marriages, I did a study of the families in the Quran and the Bible and came to the conclusion that they were all dysfunctional. And so I don't think necessarily that a family is supposed to be functional. But what are we supposed to learn from the dysfunctionalities of family? There are things to learn in the trials and tribulations that families go through. And certainly fidelity is one of them, the faithfulness that we have to families. So I want to talk a little about dogs. We have a great theologian from Persia, Ghazali, who's one of the sources of some of Aquinas' insights. He recognizes him. He died in 1111. But Ghazali used as a model to personify what's called the concupiscent soul and the irascible soul and the rational soul, he used the model of the pig, the dog, and the sage. And the idea that we have this dog-like nature, that there is something in us that is like a dog, but that is supposed to be faithful. But what happens when the dog goes wrong? There's a man in California, he's a Mexican immigrant that snuck into the United States. Now he's a multimillionaire. Welcome to America. He basically treats dogs of stars for $100,000. He can cure any dog, apparently, from its problems. But what he said in the New York Times article that I read, discovering him, was that it's always a problem with the owner. It's never a problem with the dog. And so he always has to find out what's wrong with the owner. But he said invariably, it boils down to one thing. They want to treat the dog as an equal. And dogs don't want to be treated as equals. They want to be treated as dogs. They want to know that they're supposed to be subservient. They're supposed to be told sit. But when it's like, oh, my loving dog, and lapping it up and kissing it on the lips and these things, the dog is troubled by that type of attitude. That is very similar to your nature, your dog nature. If you don't treat your bestial nature as something that is supposed to be subservient to your higher nature, the better angels of our nature, if we don't treat our human nature and recognize what was said earlier, that we do have a bestial side, we do have a very ugly side, it can be unfaithful. It can completely take over if we treat it like an equal. If we don't recognize that the root of desire in our language is from a word, desideria, from the stars. That what we really desire is so much higher than what we think we desire. The mystery of sexuality. We now talk about having sex. That was something that would be so alien to pre-modern peoples. We used to say making love, because love, the intimacy between a male and a female bonded in love, the conjugal bond of love, is making love. It is love incarnate. It is love becoming flesh. That is what it's about. Fidelity is rooted in human desire. We want to be faithful. Like Auden says in his poem, The Commuter says every day, I will be faithful to my wife. I will be faithful to my wife. This is how we thrive in our humanity by overcoming our bestial nature. It's when we allow the bestial nature to override us. And unfortunately, we're living in a culture now that is telling us that it's deconstructed all these things. They're no longer meaningful. They're no longer purposeful. And my mother's 89 years old. She recently said to me, I'm glad I'm on my way out. And that's a very troubling statement to hear from somebody who was born when films were just emerging and they were still silent. Her father grew up in a world without cars, without technology, a devout, Orthodox Christian, a very different world from the one our young people are inheriting. But I just want to leave you with this before we hear the next panel. It's so wonderful to see so many young people here, because it's your future. Those of us who are getting older and moving out, this is your world. You should be upset at what's happened. You should have indignation. Indignation is a great quality, to feel righteously angry about what's being done. The rape of the earth can only be understood in our relationships with people. It can only be understood within the context of our relationships with people. When we treat people like things, and we treat things as people should be treated. So many of us forget that inherent I-thou relationship, which is only realized in a true marriage bond. It is only realized. Kierkegaard said you have to have true love for at least one human being, unconditional, forgiving, filled with really true love, that when that happens, we can learn to extend that out. One of the things that Rumi says is, what a love the sun gives the earth. It never says, oh earth, look at all that I have done for you. That is a love that can fill up the world. That is a love that can brighten the world. So Love is a beautiful thing. Fidelity is a great thing. The temptations are there. They'll always be there. They've always been there. But those of us who are willing in the face of temptation to be true, like Shakespeare said, love is not love that alters when it alteration finds. He ends that by talking about love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. What an extraordinary statement. That real love grows as the flesh diminishes. Real love grows when you see your spouse aging and you love the wrinkles. You love the wrinkles. And I've been married 25 years, I'm talking from real experience. As my wife worries about certain lines that have shown up, no, I love those lines. They're meaningful for me because I shared those with her. That is the love. And that's not something that's alien to our modern culture. In fact, that very same statement can be said in a country western song. Not Shakespeare, but the same sentiment. They say that time takes its toll on a body, makes a young girl's brown hair turn gray, but honey, I don't care. I ain't in love with your hair. And if it all fell out, I'd still love you anyway.
Seth, I've got to ask you a question.
You got it.
What happened on the program?
Oh, I'm just letting it free. It's like XM satellite today. Go ahead.
I was listed first. Now I've got to follow these three tremendous people. You've got it's incredible. Can I get a refund?
No rules, just right. We're like Outback Steakhouse. No rules, just
All right.
Okay.
Just tremendous. You heard the energy and power, these faith traditions coming together and expressing themselves. And now you've got to listen to me. Princeton Review just rated, I think for the last maybe 10 years straight, BYU is stone cold sober. #1 school in the country.
Let's have a hand for that. That's great.
Our form of excitement is when two men are sitting down to drink and, how much do you want? I think I'm going to take a 2%. You don't want the full milk? I would like to address something that one of the organizers, Cassandra De Benedetto, asked that we could possibly have come up in this part of the panel. And that is how faith and reason might impact the culture that we're in. Now, it hasn't come up yet, so I've got to bring it up here. One of the great statements on this is from Pope John Paul II. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth, so that philosophy and theology need each other. I was looking online recently at the talk given by Dr. Albert Mohler, president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. It's a wonderful website. You go onto the website, and you've got this page that comes up, and the statement is, truth, the foundation for learning. So I clicked on Dr. Mohler's talk, and he laid out there what he felt would be necessary for the flourishing of the future of the Southern Baptist Convention. It's tremendous. I would say humbly that is something that we could all learn from, and I would encourage you to have a look at Dr. Mohler's words. They're frank, insightful, powerful. One of the areas that he was concerned about was perhaps giving ourselves over sometimes, and maybe some of us in a university setting, to rationality, exclusive rationality. What have others said about this? Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson, fixed reason firmly in her seat and called to her tribunal every fact, every opinion, question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve of the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear. Particularly to university students who are well acquainted with, if not in word, at least in practice, Immanuel Kant's dictum that enlightenment is man's release from his self-imposed immaturity, that makes sense. Martin Luther, however, wrote, "Reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. It never comes to the aid of spiritual things, but, more frequently than not, struggles against the divine word, treating with contempt all that emanates from God. In fact, John Adams, in a letter to Jefferson, writing about Napoleon, the aftermath, you could say, of Napoleon after his Waterloo, called Napoleon a water sprout. And he said, in thinking about the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, and humanity will never again, I hope, blindly surrender themselves to an unbounded ambition for national conquests. The free release of these things that he thought went out of bounds, unbounded, unregulated, disordered, unstructured. Professor George mentioned today, I think, something that is incredibly important. I'm not going to quote what he said there, but he's written elsewhere. According to the classic liberal arts ideal, our critical engagement with great thinkers enriches our understanding and enables us to grasp, or grasp more fully, great truths. Truths that, when we appropriate them and integrate them, that word again, into our lives, liberate us from what is merely vulgar, coarse, or base. These are soul-shaping. The classic liberal arts proposition is that intellectual knowledge has a role to play in making self-transcendence possible. These contrasting views of what liberal learning is supposed to liberate us from reflect competing understandings of what human beings fundamentally are and what it is possible for us to become. And so in speaking about this, he suggests what Hume said, and he mentioned that in his talk today. Hume writes, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." Professor George suggests, though, that the self is constituted not by powers of rationality that enable us to know what is humanly good and morally right and direct our desires toward it. Rather, it is constituted by our desires themselves. That's the great fallacy. Reason's role in our conduct can be nothing more than instrumental. It cannot and is not the master of desire. It is only its servant. It's one of the dangers that I think he was trying to point out, that when you instrumentalize reason, when the passions dictate to reason what it can do, rather than reason using the passions as the instrument to achieve ends, we have some of the troubles that perhaps Adams and Jefferson were corresponding about in the French Revolution. Tom Wolfe, in a recent publication, also speaks about this. The dualism question that Professor George raised is essentially what he calls the ghost in the machine. Is there a self separate from the person? Can you separate the self from the person? Wolfe thinks not, and he says that when we do, the notion of a self, particularly in light of neuroscience and what its kind of determinism, at least certain neuroscientists in propagating it, a self who exercises self-discipline, postpones gratification, curbs the sexual appetite, stops short of aggression and criminal behavior, a self who can become more intelligent and lift itself to the very peaks of life by its own bootstraps through study, practice, perseverance, and refusal to give up in the face of great odds, this self is slipping away. Newman recognized this debate, this competing notion of reason versus passion, or how reason and passion interact with each other. And he said knowledge and reason are sure ministers to faith. The church fears no knowledge. Cardinal Pell, though, adds, although secularized knowledge often fears the church, this is not because the church's claims are intrinsically ridiculous or unreasonable, but because they emphasize truths about given questions. The humanity of the unborn child, the humanity of the old, disabled and sick, the wrongness of unjust working conditions that many in our society would prefer to disregard for a wide range of reasons. He later cites Cardinal Newman as saying that reason alone, though, might not be enough because of they need to contend against those giants, this is the quotation from Newman, the passion and pride of man. Getting back to what Dr. Moore was saying, this desire, this sexual desire that is in us, is reason alone sufficient? Can reason really control the passions? Do we need assistance? Now, many of you will have been raised in a religious tradition, perhaps even one represented by the panel here. I just want to refer you, thinking about the Casses and their speech, to one small passage in Jane Eyre. You remember that she's the Quaker. Charlotte Bronte writes about her. There's a scene when Mr. Rochester tells her live with me. And she's caught off guard. She has come to admire Mr. Rochester, has come to acknowledge the kind of life that he's had and gotten to know him as she's been the tutor to one of his nieces. And he does more than simply tell her, he begins to use argument to persuade her. And she says, "While he spoke, my very conscience and reason turned traitors against me and charged me with crime in resisting him. They spoke almost as loud as feeling, and that clamored wildly. Comply, it said. Think of his misery. Think of his danger. Look at his state when left alone. Remember his headlong nature. Consider the recklessness following on despair. Save him, soothe him, love him. Tell him you love him and will be his. Who will be injured by what you do?" Still, indomitable was the reply. "I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad as I am now. Laws and principles are not for the times when there is no temptation. They are for such moments as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent are they, inviolate they shall be. If at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? They have a worth. So I have always believed, and if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire and my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. Preconceived opinions, foregone determinations are all I have at this hour to stand by. There I plant my foot." And this is what Father Richard Newhouse might call something like mediating structures, friends, associations, teachings that we've had, things that we've gotten from our associations with our churches, the Boy Scouts of America, the World Congress and the Family, things that have been taught to you that in your hour of personal need, and we've been speaking about public things here and how to address the public, but in person, you need to call on those reserves. And they can come to your assistance. George Weigel says we have to be very careful not to allow the state to occupy every inch of social space. We've already seen in the 20th centuries what disasters that's led to with Nazism and communism. So in your personal lives, what things are there to mediate in that moment when these passions are so prominent? Your own faith can help you there. Authority and tradition, as Professor George mentioned through Alistair McIntyre, are resources. Authority and tradition don't have to, of necessity, come to your assistance. There can even be authorities and traditions that you ought not to listen to. But they can come to your assistance as resources, as well as your faith and your reason. But they need to work in combination, as the Pope articulated, two wings of a dove. It's a beautiful metaphor, a beautiful image. Mike Huckabee and Janet, his wife, were married on Valentine's Day 2005. You could say, like Seth did, it was their second marriage. No divorce involved here. We're talking about a covenant marriage that they entered into. He's governor of Arkansas, as you know. Arkansas, as it was prominently reported, had the nation's second highest divorce rate. What wasn't reported, Andrew Cherlin informs us, is that it also has the nation's highest marriage rate. People know to be married there. But marriage isn't easy. And the covenant marriage that Governor Huckabee entered into with his wife was one in which they committed to each other that they would support one another, and even in times of stress, would seek out other assistance. In fact, I learned of a tradition, Pastor Moore, you'll have to tell me if this is something that's widespread in the evangelical community, a beautiful tradition in which when the minister marries a couple, he'll turn to those in the room, like all of you if we had someone here at the altar, and asks them, you as witnesses, will you support this couple? They've now committed to be married. And you as the community, will you help to support? This is what Andrew Cherlin calls the publicly enforceable trust of our associations together. You've already heard today about some of the difficulties that people face in pornography. Certainly you could read from Marianne Grossman about the hookup culture. There may be other areas, though, where you could be strengthened. Doctors Diane Levin and Jane Kilborn even speak of simple things that we might consider simple, at least, such as rated R films. What do we expose ourselves to? And they're particularly concerned about exposure of young people to some of the violence that's involved in its connection to sexuality. Do you find time in your personal lives to strengthen yourselves in your daily devotions? I was impressed. I was walking over and I saw Father Mode, who's the Navy chaplain for the Coast Guard Academy. We have some of the cadets right here. And he was sitting in a quiet place reading the Bible. He was finding time, even in the busy schedules that we have, to read the good book, to turn to the text. I will just close by mentioning something that Roger Scruton, a philosopher, suggests, another assistance to us in our own striving for this refinement of passions. He says that we need to train the ear and restore the eye. A very difficult subject to speak about with young people sometimes, because you're so used to being immersed in your own culture. We're not talking about things like the pornography that Pamela Paul spoke about. We're not talking about things such as Wendy Shallett and the return to modesty as such. The things that you might imbibe of on a normal daily basis. Roger Scruton just calls us to remember, as did Alan Bloom, as does Carson Holloway at Nebraska, that we need to be aware of the things that we listen to, training the ear. This isn't just a call to high culture. He's suggesting that in listening to mainly beat as opposed to rhythm, by not paying attention to harmonies of music, by listening only to mechanical music, music in which machines have edited voices and sound, we lose the ability to understand counterpoint, to understand deeper tonal structures. This is a part of the refinement. In the Magic Flute, the great Catholic composer Mozart, in one of his final operas, written in the last year of his life, writes an opera in which the libretto talks about a man and a woman and the journeying of these two to refine themselves before they enter into a covenantal relationship with each other, a covenantal marriage that's performed in the opera. But they need to refine these. And in that piece, in this opera, Mozart shows that in a particular scene where beasts are made still by this magic flute, and then the tenor, Tamino, turns to the audience and says, would that we would all be able to calm the beasts in us. So music is one path, and Scruton also suggests that restoring the eye, looking at being careful about the things that we view, obviously pornography, but also remembering what the 18th century thinkers remind us of, that the mass harmony and scale of the things we see, he mentions in particular great architecture, like a Gothic cathedral with all of its tensions preserved there, imprint themselves on our mind's eye, and we assume in our souls the mass harmony and scale of the things that we see and we expose ourselves to. So these are the things, I think, that can help us to refine those passions, to assist our reason, along with the mediating structures that we have opportunities to involve ourselves with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the timing works out because I want to ask one question of the panel, then we'll take our break and we'll come back and it'll be all you and all the panel interacting together with your input, your feedback, and your questions. My question for each panelist, I guess I'd like to take a quick stab at, and maybe people can think about it on the break as well as this. The Casses last night spoke about how it is easier to show the problems in our society and our culture than it is to point out to the solutions. The college campus, the university campus, all of you have a foot in it while you have two arms and your other foot in the world outside the campus, is a different place than the rest of the country, culturally, economically, in almost every way imaginable. One statistic that you're fighting against, almost 50% of college students in America have a drug or alcohol abuse problem. That's not true outside of the university. The numbers are high, they're not that high. Isn't there something about the country outside of the university, outside of the elite institutions, that is endemically much more representative of what the students here today represent? And are they not the ones more prepared to enter that place? You gave us Randy Travis. I'm going to give you Kenny Chesney. He talks about he has a song called The Good Stuff. A man very depressed walks into a bar, and he says to the bartender, give me the bottle of the good stuff. And he says, the bartender didn't reach around for the whiskey. He didn't pour me a beer. His blue eyes got misty, and he said, you can't find that in here. Country music, the reason I mention it, he goes on to define things about marriage being the good stuff, and fidelity and faith. Country music is the largest music platform in America. That's right. People don't realize that Taylor Swift outsold Britney Spears last year. Right. Taylor only makes People and Us magazine when Kanye West does something to her. Kanye West was outsold by Kenny Chesney last year. Right? There is something endemically good about America. That's just, I took country music. If you're going to give us Randy, I had to do it too, because it's a small point, but I think it's a big one, and I wonder if each of you might say something about that and what the students here represent in the context of the larger culture, which the teachers are sending them out to. You can use this or sit, doesn't matter, whatever you're comfortable with. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think the main thing that you ought to represent as you're working within a university fabric is to understand that you're living in an artificial type of cocoon in many ways. And so what I would say is start by just seeing yourselves not as guys, but as men, and not as girls, but as women, and start cultivating within yourselves an attitude toward marriage and family. I mean, the question that was asked earlier, how many of you are engaged or how many of you want to be engaged, is really a very good question, because on so many college campuses, that seems to be something that is at a completely different stage of life. Now, I think that that's relevant even for those of you who have no relationship and no seeming hope of being married anytime in the near future at all, in cultivating yourselves into being the kind of man who can be a faithful husband to a wife and children. So that the decisions that you are making right now are decisions that are being made in order to be faithful to a future wife whose name you do not yet know, and future children, if Providence brings that about, who you cannot imagine right now. Same thing with women. Creating within yourselves a type of restraint and a type of cultivation that sees yourself future directed toward marriage and family. Recognizing and knowing that university culture is not always the way it is going to be, it's not even the way it is now. And that's part of the reason why when Seth mentions alcohol use and drug use veering off into all kinds of extremes, a lot of that is because the kind of life you're trying to live is not normal. This is not the way it's meant to be. And the kind of disappointment that comes along with that is palpable. And so I would say the main thing for you is not only to kind of minister within the university culture, but to be outside of the university culture. Be among real, regular people in churches and associations and other places in which you are seeing not only your peers, but also families at various stages of life, learning to love those people and to give yourselves to those people.
I really think that there are systemic problems that just get exacerbated or that come to the head in college. I went to Brown undergrad, and I was a complete idiot, although I got a degree. And the joke I'm making there is the expectation coming into college is meant to be quite different than Van Helsing and from Animal House and the inmates that I went into college expecting. I think it really gets back to that original understanding of what it means to be educated, this fundamental educare, the drawing out of a person to become who you are. And that vocational discernment, literally not just a state of life, but the vocation meaning, what am I being called to do? Who am I being called to be? And I believe what Dr. Moore speaking about in terms of manhood and womanhood is precisely that. That the fundamental role from boyhood to manhood is one of that view that's turned into ourselves from one that's turned toward the good of the other. It's simplistic, but it's profound when you meditate on it. That at its core, every decision we make, every dollar we spend, every person we associate with is animated, literally anima, it's ensouled by this decision for the good of another. And approaching your school, approaching your job hopes, approaching your vision of who you are at 30, animates 4 years in college. And I know the example, if we approach college as simply the paper that we required as the next step in order to get the interview, in order to get the job, in order to get the partnership, in order to get the cash, in order to get the... We follow that train out, and I follow that because I was on those tracks. You follow that out, and in the end, you end up at happiness. No matter where you start out, everything you think you want, from the job, to the money, to the house, to the car, to the props, to everything else, it ends up in, what do you want? I want to be happy. And that's the kind of brass tacks, back to the basic vocational discernment that you as leaders not only need to live and to animate, but you need to be able to teach it. Because teaching is that next order of maturity, of knowledge, of understanding. So the examples, you know what, when you do this, your very being will be attractive. You'll stand out even when you don't speak. There's something about a person who has a self-possession, a self-mastery, a sense of something that their purpose transcends the moment. It transcends the ecstasy of a 40-ounce beer and a joint to an ecstasy of being in complete union with another person. That there's a hope of something even greater. And it's not that you're this legalistic person who simply sets boundaries and rules of what I can and what I can't do. That's actually a weakness. That's how many of us begin in our faith journey, by requiring the boundaries of legalism. We need law. We need rules. Tell me what I can do. How far can I go? Before. Can I do? And we need those boundaries to get started. That's what our faith tradition calls the purgative stage of our development. We need to purge out all those things that speak against our dignity. But the purgative stage, purging all that bad out, is not just meant to be legalist. It's meant to move us to that next stage of being able to see differently. And the mystics call that the illuminative stage, where we can see God everywhere. Our sight changes. And that now makes us someone who's not just repulsing the bad, but is now able to see the good. But even that illumination will set you apart in this world. That's not the final stage. The real final stage is what the mystics call a unitive stage. We not only see God, we see the good, the true, and the beautiful everywhere. We embrace it. We're attracted to it, and we become one with it. So this progression, even if we don't make it in this world, is the point of perspective that any architecture student, that any artist will use. It's the point of perspective that animates everything that we do along that path, including 4 years of idiocy in college or 4 years of meditating, dreaming, hoping for something greater than what it is now, and then, again, being at that stage where you can not only animate it and live it, but that you can teach others to do it.
Seth began this talking about the fact that many people who go into university, into science and engineering, maintain their faith, and a lot of people that go into the humanities, philosophy, and these things lose their faith. A lot of that is due to the influence of critical theory and Marxism that has so immersed, our culture in a way of viewing things that the insidiousness of it is not really recognized often. That critical theory, which definitely has some advantages, and I'm reasonably well read in critical theory, but when critical theory becomes the lens by which everything is viewed, we're in a very serious problem. When the liminal, when the marginalized becomes normative, when what's on the outside of the bell curve of normality becomes the normative and what's being taught. And this is going on in universities all over America. There's a lot of confused young people out there. And I feel for a lot of these young people. But I would argue, I had a dear friend who was a Algerian woman who grew up in Algeria but came to America as a young woman. She was a physician. She said one of the things that really struck her about American culture that bothered her was the idea of boyfriend and girlfriends and this idea of practicing relationships, because she said they always end in broken relationships, and so it's as if they're setting these people up to have expectations of broken relationships. And I would say, you know, like the Jewish mother to her daughter, when the milk is free, why pay for the cow? That unfortunately the onus is often on the women to really recognize that they are being used and abused in this sexualized culture. They are being used and abused in this sexualized culture. And until the women really begin reasserting their power, because women have immense power. Just read Lysistrata, Aristophanes, and you'll know about the power of women that was recognized by the ancient Greeks. Their power is sexual. It is a power that women have always had over men, and if they don't assert that power in positive ways, men will debase that power in negative ways. And unfortunately, when you have pornography as rife as it is in our culture, because we didn't really talk a lot about culture, but the degradation of our culture, this complete inversion where ugly becomes beautiful. Our buildings are ugly, our clothes are ugly, you know, our hairstyles are ugly. I mean, something is very seriously wrong with a culture that sees ugliness as beauty. Even our music has become incredibly ugly. I mean, there's so much discordance, cacophony, things that people that, you know, Plato would just be, I think, I don't know what he would think of our culture. Tolstoy warned us in his essay, What is Art?, about what would happen to a culture that divorced its art from morality. When art becomes ars gratia artis, art for art's sake, entertainment for entertainment's sake. Entertainment at its best is always edifying. You shouldn't go to a film to watch somebody sawed in pieces as a form of entertainment. Something is wrong when Saw is a blockbuster hit, and they're up to 9 or 10 now, where people go and watch other people tortured as a form of entertainment. What has happened to us? What has happened to us? You can blame it on Princeton, because Alan Turing has so much to do with this. I mean, in reality, you know, the technology, the inability to keep up ethically with the pace of technological innovation, the ability to recognize that technology is a double-edged sword. And I recommend reading Ornstein's book about the axe maker's gift. Plato talks about the man who brought writing to the king of Egypt and says, this is a great invention, it will help people remember things. And he said it's for the inventor to present his invention for others to judge its utility. Inventors always tell you how wonderful their inventions are, but the king notes that it will actually have the opposite effect. People will lose their memory. They'll lose their ability. What's happening with so much of this immense technology that is becoming more and more powerful is that we're losing sight. Our young people can't do basic math anymore because everything is done in calculators. Our children are seeing images. How will a man and a woman have real intimacy when they've heard all the lines before in so many films, when everything's been said and done? How can they really experience love? And love will never be as good as when the theater score is as powerful as it is during their intimacy. You know, so we've got real serious problems, but I would really tell the women in this room and around this country, they need to reassert their power. They need, like the woman that needs to, the person who's having trouble with the dog, assert your moral superiority and your authority, because our men need taming. They need being brought back in to what is true to the masculine nature, chivalry, and these extraordinary virtues that have always been honored in every culture and civilization. Virtues, we're lacking this so much. So, there are many disturbing things that I see all over, because I travel all over to these campuses, but those were just some of the few things that have really troubled me of late.
I will allow my esteemed colleagues to sweep the field philosophically. Maybe I could speak about a couple of pragmatic things. When I was here at Princeton as a Madison Fellow for the year, was very impressed, as it's in this description in the booklet, by the Anscombe Society. Here's a society that was organized in a university culture because students weren't finding peers who shared similar values as they did, who shared a similar desire for a kind of a life as they did. I think that's a practical application within a university context to, if you are seeking that, if you don't have that kind of association, you may want to think about actually forming something like that within the university context. On another level, you've all worked with professors. Sometimes assistant professors, when they're newly hired, will have an attitude, understandably so, given publishing pressures, the desire to keep their jobs, and pressures from deans to continue to put out articles and books. They'll say, I can't really work with students too much now, but after tenure, in about 7 years, I'll find the time to work with those students. David Brooks, New York Times writer, wrote about Princeton University students. He called them the organization kid, people who are incredibly organized. Everything seemed organized. And he wondered about, where are the relationships there? I would say that to the professor who says, I'll wait 7 years, by the time that 7 years are finished, you haven't formed the habits to be able to interact with students. You haven't formed the habits to be able to know how to make time. In 7 years, many things could have changed in the professor's career. There might be a new home involved. There may be a new child or additional children. There could be a change in other circumstances, any number of things. You only have the present to be able to learn habits for self-mastery and for working. Within the Latter-day Saint tradition, we have a family night every week. Mother and father and children gather together to be together, to learn about things, whether they're things in science or the scriptures, or to take a trip together, but it's something that happens every week as a habit, so that father or mother don't say, I'm working really hard now, I'll do that, I'll start this tradition next year. In your own lives, your self-mastery can begin now, if you wish. You can learn the habits that are necessary for you to be able to respond and cope with the culture around you. And it's very helpful to have peers when you do that. Hence the thought of finding others who are like you in your own churches, in your social associations, or creating your own at a university culture, so that you have resources around you as you make those attempts. Finally, getting back to David Brooks and the New York Times article, I would be very careful about instrumentalizing your relationships. Many of you, of course, are away from home, and it's important that you grow. But your parents are your parents, and your grandparents are your grandparents. They are your family. Make sure that when you're away, your studies and all of the other activities that you have don't crowd out the continuing family relationships that you have within your families of origin. And don't instrumentalize your friends. The hookup culture is the worst version of that. But there's probably a continuum on that spectrum, with the hookup culture being the worst version, but other ways in which you might end up using people and using your associations. People are the ends, not the means through which we get things. You can become very coarse and hardened, not because you've done explicitly negative things morally inside of university experience, but because you have manipulated others or used others for your ends. And I think a university experience can be a time when you learn not to do that, when you learn that it is about, as Janet Madigan said at the beginning, the kind of love that Pope Benedict speaks about that reaches outward to others, and that is not the grasping type.
All right, Cassie, what? We're doing a 12, 15-minute break, 10-minute break?
10, 15-minute break, and then we'll be back here for Q&A.
Q&A when we come back. Thank you.